Okay, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about aggregate demand. In particular, I'm going to talk about why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, and there are three reasons why it does. These three here. I'm going to talk about the second one, the interest rate effect. But before we get to that, let's just look at the curve itself. And you should do the reading. Aggregate demand is basically total spending in an economy. There's some other things to be said about it, but I'll let you look at what's in the reading. When we graph it, what we need to have on the horizontal axis is real GDP. Okay, and now that we know about real and nominal, pretty much we only care about real values. Real GDP, real prices, real wages, real interest rates, whatever it might be. Okay, so that's our horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we want to have a price level. It's going to have numbers like these. Okay, and let's say that real GDP is in billions, so it would be higher than that for the US, but that's fine. And then the curve itself is going to be downward sloping with a pretty steep slope. So something like this. Okay, and you can look at that in the reading, of course. Now, when we're talking about these three effects, what we're talking about is if the price level goes down, so if, say, we go from 110 to 100, we are going to go from this point on the aggregate demand curve to this one. And that in turn means that GDP is going to increase from there to there. On the other hand, if, say, we go from 95 to 105 for our price level, then we're going from this point on the aggregate demand curve to this one here. And so aggregate demand, i.e. GDP, is, well, not too much room here, but it's going down from this point here to this one here. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with these effects, the price level changing and that having some effect on aggregate demand. And we're measuring aggregate demand in amounts of real GDP. So when the price level changes, aggregate demand changes, which means that real GDP changes. Okay, so the interest rate effect. All right, so here's the story. Okay, so if the price level goes down, which is to say that the economy is experiencing deflation, the price level drops, then consumers, firms, and the government need less money to make their purchases. Okay, and some of the money that they don't spend will be moved into savings. Now, when that happens, okay, so when this money is moved into savings, banks are going to take that money and use it to make loans. So the savings becomes the deposits, and the deposits are going to become what we call loanable funds. That is just money that can be loaned. All right, now we're still talking about the interest rate effect, but we have to take a little detour here and look at supply and demand. And this is supply and demand in the way that we were talking about it earlier in the semester. Supply and demand for these loanable funds. Okay, so we have a normal supply curve and a demand curve. They're going to intersect somewhere. On the horizontal axis, we have loanable funds, whatever the quantity of them might be. Okay, now think for a moment, what is the price of loanable funds? If you take out a loan, how do you pay for that? I mean, of course, you pay it back, but the actual cost of the loan is going to be paid in interest. So on the vertical axis, we need to have interest. Okay, so initially we are here with some interest rate. Interest rate 1. And some quantity of money that can be used to make loans. All right, now if the supply of loanable funds increases, which it will if these two things happen, this extra money that isn't being used to make purchases is saved, moved into savings, then the supply of loanable funds is going to increase. Okay, in which case, what's going to happen to our interest rate? It's going to go down. Quantity of loanable funds will increase. Okay, now let's think about one more thing. So depositors put their money into banks. Okay, so on our supply and demand for loanable funds, the supply is coming from savers, or at least initially, that's the way we're looking at it. And the demand is coming from banks. Okay, and so this interest rate here would be the interest rate that savers are paid for leaving their money in a savings account. All right, now next, or even at the same time, banks are using this money to make loans to whoever wants a loan. All right, so when we think about this part of the process here, the banks have the supply of loanable funds now, and it's people who want loans that are on the demand side. Okay, it doesn't really change too much. If supply increases, it's still going to be the case that the interest rate's going to go down and the supply of loanable funds is going to increase. But it's worth understanding that banks are essentially on both sides of this supply and demand. Just depends at what point we're looking at it. All right, so interest rates go down. When the price level goes down, interest rates go down, and that means that firms will borrow money and spend on investment. And when we're talking about investment here, we're talking about it in the GDP sense of the term. That is, when we use it as a category for GDP. So actually, let's just look at that again. Oops. Here, okay, so on this page, recall that business spending is what we refer to as investment. So we're talking about investment in that sense. When calculating GDP, investment does not mean buying stocks or bonds, which, as we already noted, are not included in GDP. Rather, investment is purchases of new capital goods. For example, buildings, factories, equipment, that kind of stuff. Purchases of new residential housing are also included in investment, not in the consumption category. Okay, so interest rates go down, firms will borrow and spend on investment, and consumers will borrow and buy homes, cars, other things that you might take out a loan to purchase. I don't know what that would be. Boats, I guess. Just land. Okay, and homes go in the investment category, actually. So most of what's going on here has to do with that investment category of GDP. All right, so to sum up, when the price level goes down, interest rates go down, borrowing goes up, spending on investment goes up, and maybe a few other things like cars or boats or those sorts of things. But mostly investment here, investment spending. And when that happens, since investment is a part of GDP, aggregate demand goes up, which just means that GDP goes up. Okay, so recall that we're measuring aggregate demand in terms of amounts of GDP, so these two are really the same. Everything else here is one thing causing the next thing to happen. Okay, and then I'll just write it out for you. Everything will happen in reverse if the price level is increasing. That is, if we have inflation. Okay, so price level goes down, aggregate demand goes up, price level goes up, aggregate demand goes down. And that's just what we said here. Let's see what we have drawn. Price level goes up. We're going to go from here to here on the aggregate demand curve, which means that, well, aggregate demand and GDP are going down. Okay, there we go.